Did you know that GST subsumed 17 taxes and 13 cesses to enable a seamless movement of goods throughout India? Did you know that 70% of GST tax collections come from two tax bands? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I'm your host, Anil Padmanabhan. The recent controversy over taxing of popcorn has put the wrong kind of spotlight on the goods and services tax or GST. It was the worst kind of tax overreach. The best part of it is that the extra collections is barely a blip on overall GST tax revenues. The clumsiness of the move smacks of Babugiri or bureaucratic overreach and exposes the flaws in the rollout of what was potentially a game-changing tax reform. Further, this kind of tax overreach to push up tax collections is killing India's growth story. The obvious question then is whether it is time to rethink GST. After all, it's more than 7 years since its rollout, and there's considerable amount of information about the pros and cons on GST and rollout GST 2.0. To answer this and more, I spoke to Haseeb Drabu. Haseeb is an economist, a former finance minister of Jammu and Kashmir, and a founding member of the GST regime. But before we dive into our conversation with Haseeb, here's a short explainer on GST and the popcorn controversy.
The Goods and Service Tax or GST was launched on 1st July 2017. It required the centre and states to pool their tax sovereignties. This sacrifice in turn enabled a collapsing of tax jurisdictions, subsuming 17 taxes and 13 cesses levied by the union and state governments. For the first time, the country was economically unified, allowing for seamless movement of goods. However, somewhere along the way, the GST rollout lost its way. It is now threatening the idea of one nation, one tax. The controversy over GST on popcorn was just another example. Even insiders are prompting a course correction and took to X, the social media platform, to vent. Reacting to the decision of the GST Council on the tax on popcorn, Krishnamurthy Subramanian, former chief economic advisor, said, "What is the rationale for a decision that can max contribute 0.013% to revenue but inconvenience to citizens? Complexity is a bureaucrat's delight and citizens' nightmare." In an equally harsh indictment, Mohandas Pai, the former CFO of Infosys, said, "This is silly and complex. Will lead to tax terrorism. Citizens are becoming victims of bad policy, which will make them hostages to rent-seeking officials and create disputes. GST needs to be simplified." The writing is on the wall.
I began by asking Haseeb on his first thoughts on the controversy about taxing popcorn. After all, he was a founding member of the GST regime.
This is not the first time this happened. This has happened. It's been happening while we were in the GST Council also. That time it was about papads with jeera and papads without jeera. Now it's popcorn with sweet whatever. I think more than anything else, what it does is damage the optics of it is very bad. It's not that it's fundamentally going to alter the structure of GST, but what it does is the broad message. Because what you also need for GST to succeed is a certain level of understanding of a common person who actually pays the GST. It seems so frivolous and so, this thing that the entire credibility of GST comes into question because of issues like this. And it also takes you back in time to a regime which one was trying to change through the GST. If you recollect, in excise duties, we used to have shoes with laces, shoes without laces. Now shoes with laces but with rubber soles and shoes without laces with leather soles would attract vastly different excise duties. So the whole idea of this shift then comes into question, that why are you trying to go back? There were two principal things that one was trying to do with GST fundamentally, quite apart from the tax regime part of it. One was to reduce the dispersal of rates, and the other was to avoid exemptions. Exemptions because that was seen as the political economy of taxation, that corporates who had clout would get their products exempted or reduced or whatever. Now we seem to be, though the scope of that is limited, we seem to be going back on both these things. One is the rate dispersals, and second is the exemptions. Now, if that is so, then are you in some ways going back to a regime which you are trying to change? So it doesn't stop at just the popcorn bit. What it does is it allows the system to look at rates which are not, which were supposed to be originally, and we'll discuss that, only a few rates, and second, make specific exemptions. So I think that's where the trouble lies. But as I said, this is not the first time that we have had. In fact, I recollect a discussion in the council which talked about square papads and round papads.
Okay, Haseeb, taking up from your round papad and square papad, tell me something that if you were aware of these pitfalls, so how come as a founding member and as a part of the founding team, you people did not build guardrails in the GST Council to prevent going down the slippery path?
There were much bigger issues. It's not about states like us. The kind of to build a consensus. I mean, I still feel it was someone like Mr. Arun Jaitley who could do it. There was tremendous amount of diversity of opinion. So these issues really were not didn't come to the fore. But what probably could have been done, and I was thinking about it while you were speaking, is that institutionally, one big mistake that perhaps we made was to let the rate fixing committee be completely with the bureaucracy. Now, I think that's where the rub lies, because what happened in the initial phase, we did have these, committees of what are called the GOMs, the group of ministers and all that. But at that time, because there was, it was still being laid out, the rate fixing committee was entirely comprised of the bureaucracy. What the GST Council would do is to give broad guidelines, the funneling part of it, what should come within what bracket. But the actual rate fixation was being done by a set of bureaucrats who have a tendency to actually start nitpicking and, try and put those loopholes that don't exist. So I think perhaps what could be done or should have been done was to have one of the ministers or a political kind of a leadership at the rate fixation committee level, so that such anomalous things don't come in and you don't lose the wood for the trees, because that's what seems to be essentially happening now.
But Haseeb, the fitment committee is headed by a minister. In this case, it's headed by the deputy chief minister in Bihar. So there is a political leadership to it.
Yeah,
so the
that's
bureaucrats
the
are
fixing
just
committee. I'm talking about the fixation, because the exact rates then get fixed by a set of bureaucrats who then bring it to the council for approval. And at that stage, I don't think it has been noticed in this case. But my whole point being that there should be a political input at that level as well, which would not allow such anomalous things to come in. Because the bureaucracy, the tax regime, the tax bureaucracy comes from a mindset of control, not of regulation. And this is a self-regulation thing. The whole idea of GST was that you will self-regulate rather than kind of have this, and the whole system was built of randomizing the deviations and then through a statistical method pick up the deviant cases and then arrive at that. But that seems to be now hasn't taken shape as of now, from what I can see. Perhaps that's another route that one can follow is to, by now though the bureaucracy should have adjusted to it, but seems it hasn't, which is where I would think this is coming from.
But it's very counterintuitive to expect that the tail will wag the dog. So the bureaucracy can input, can influence, but they can't be taking such monumental decisions regarding tax like GST. So, why is it that the political leadership is not stepping in and resolving this?
Yeah, I think you're right too, because it does at the end of the day come to the council. What we had at the beginning was some fairly well regarded economists like Isaac and others who were in the council, and the inputs from the political side were perhaps far more incisive than they are today. So I think that's where one would look at the political leadership taking lead on such matters, and preventing such things. But then you have to also understand that the political leadership itself is not very objective. There are compulsions, huge compulsions. We had tremendous amount of debates on how to tax ice cream because it was a major item in Gujarat. Major item. I mean, we have spent so much time on doing that kind of stuff, on whether the casata ice cream is square or in what form the ice cream is served. Taxation gets done because there are huge interests that do weigh upon the political class to take a view in the council. So it's perhaps what you're right. Maybe you're right. It's a bit of both. It's a bit of political compulsions that do exist, and also the desire of the bureaucracy to nitpick and start controlling what was essentially a self-regulated system.
Asif, this point which you made about ice cream, because it's always treated as a near luxury good, so it has to be taxed higher. But that's the problem also with GST right from the beginning. Virtue signaling has crept in from the word go. It ignores two things. One, that this is an ad valorem tax, it's not a specific tax. So even if I impose 18% on salt, it's nowhere going to match an 18% on, say, a luxury good, right? So why did this not get fixed right at the beginning? This virtue signaling, is it politics dominating economics?
No, I mean the system, if you recollect, first of all, you had to funnel in more than 10,000 commodities into 5 buckets. So obviously there was an issue there. There was also a concern at that stage about the revenue neutrality of these rates. Are we going, because these are uncharted waters, and today you can look back, and because we are getting a revenue of a lakh 80,000 crores a month, we were struggling to see if it 70,000 is 60,000 would be possible. So I think that those considerations were very significant ones, whereby you were trying to funnel all these. Signaling really happened only in one bucket, which was the sin good category, and that's 28%. And you added basically that part remaining, and also the merit goods. So in some ways beyond that, which is also well established, it's not that there's a unique thing. You may on the margin go overboard, but broadly the categorizations were there. Where the real trouble came was what to put at 14 and what to put at 12 and 18%, because that was the thing which we had hoped would collapse after a few years of GST, so that you eventually landed up with a 3-rate structure. That was what the origin was. That you would look at a 5%, you would look at a 14%, which seemed at that point the revenue neutral rate, and the 28%. Then you had the zero and the sin goods, where you added, like cigarettes, you added a lot more and made it more than 35%. But fundamentally, one was wanting to move to it. And there's a recorded decision of the GST Council, minuted, that we should move towards a 3-rate structure. There was huge opposition to it, of course, because different states had different viewpoints on it. But the consensus, and as Mr. Jetley would say very wisely, the sense of the House was we'll have 3 rates and, kind of work with 5, 14 and 28, and we should move towards that. Now, there were 2 ways of doing that. One was to take out products out of the 28 bracket, which has been happening. I can see some of it has been done, intermediate, basic goods, some of it has been done. And also by collapsing the 12 and 18% to 14.5%, which that time the chief economic advisor had worked out broadly was the RNR, the revenue neutral rate. So we were working towards that kind of a system. That somehow, that overarching principle seems to have been forgotten. Maybe it's a good time to start looking at a GST 2, which actually starts the process of reform again with the learnings of the past. We are no longer worried about the revenues. The plumbing issues are over. There are no major gaps which one can see. There is information about some avoidance, but that is bound to happen in any regime at any point of time. So maybe it's a good time to start looking at it. Also, bring in the ambit of gas and other things, electricity, real estate, what we had been talking about. Do another transaction. The first bargain was what we had done at the GST Council originally. Now maybe it's time for the second bargain with the states to see how they react to it, and in the process do rate rationalization, perhaps do a combination of both, which helps the states as well as the people. Because even now I find the general acceptability of GST within the consumers is low. I think that's something we need to address, because it seems like as if a system that squeezes everything out. If you see the social media, the FM has been roasted all over with kind of squeezing something or the other, which is rather unnecessary, because that's not the way it ought to be. So I think maybe this is the time, just before the budget, the finance minister can kind of take an initiative, have a GST Council meeting, look at some of these possibilities, and then put it in the budget to see that how we can now do a GST 2, which goes beyond what we have done. Also, cure some of the faults and anomalies that we see as of today.
So that's a nice segue into GST 2.0. So what in your view should be a GST that India should graduate to in realistic terms? Because you can't effect structural fixes to a tax like GST overnight.
The biggest reform would honestly be to move to a three-rate structure. And that is the original principle that ought to have been followed. Number one. That's something we should look at. Is there now need to do only two outliers and one rate? The two outliers being a demerit and a merit rate, and one general rate. So that would be the three. Then on this, obviously you will have to have some exemptions, like bullion will be separate or whatever. But as a structural feature, one should move towards one demerit rate, one merit rate, and one regular rate. And that needs to be now collaborated, because we have tremendous amount of cross-sectional as well as time series information on GST, which will allow you to see. Because Anil, I remember even in the sales tax days, if you had 10,000 commodities, 87% revenue came from 900 commodities. So let's also understand what is the revenue foregone for a particular category, rather than spread it so wide that it collapses the whole system. So where I would see is that the basic reform would be to move towards product categories rather than products, number one. And those product categories should be branded in three categories. Plus, of course, now do you want to take the, because this is at the end of the day a political discussion really with states as to whether you want to get into real estate, you want to get into electricity, and so on and so forth. That would be another reform. Perhaps what I had suggested, in fact, I had introduced it also, was that there should be a GST at the state level and the GST at the central level. That even if you don't allow the main GST, the current GST, to widen the ambit into electricity, real estate, and others, let the states follow the principles of GST while levying these taxes as a step into the final merger with the GST at the national level.
Okay. Finally, Haseeb, GST is an indirect tax. So inherently, it is regressive by nature. Secondly, it is a tax which is easily collected. I buy a product, I pay the tax, and the tax has to be deposited to the government. So there is an ease of collection here, unlike, say, an income tax where I need to file returns at the end of the year to confirm whatever claims or deductions I have made. So how does a government, ride this trade-off? Because it's a indirect tax, consumer is a very serious stakeholder in this. So they react. Like you said, they are all questioning the legitimacy of GST today because they are hurting instantly. And popcorn kind of messes only complicates the case. So how does a government manage that trade-off?
No, it's an important question because it is an indirect tax, no doubt about it. And not only what you said, Anil, there are, as per law, the moment you raise an invoice, you have to deposit the GST. So even before the income comes to you on a professional, let's say, income, you have to deposit an 18% GST. So there are those issues. But let's not forget one thing. One of the biggest things about GST was how do you, as a way of formalizing the Indian economy. It was the biggest thing and that has worked well. It has become formalized. You may see these, this Golgappe wala now getting 40 lakhs income and putting and thing. Those are like, exceptions to the rule. But the fact remains that formalization is a large part of, and the more you formalize, the less complicated it will become. So in a sense, it's not just a tax regime change. It's a structural change that was brought in to improve the formalization of the thing, and the gains of it are way beyond. Now, the way to go forward and get it great acceptability is make it simple and also less complicated as it is, turning out to be. So that's where the real thing would lie in terms of GST. Don't just see it while the customer certainly is a stakeholder and whatever. Once the rates come down, what you're not also factoring in that you have a proper set of a tax credit. Now that is a huge thing. If you are, yes, it involves paperwork today, but if technology allows your credit card to automatically get you into a GST thing, then the tax refunds the input tax credit that you get is not something that was available to you earlier. And today, everybody can have a GST number, right? So let's not ignore that part. The effective tax rate that you'll pay, your outgoes may be whatever, but at the end of your quarter, you will get an input tax credit if you have maintained your records. Now, this, I'm sure, was not something that everybody will agree with, but the fact remains that the effective tax rates on GST are much lower if you follow the entire system. Just don't take one segment of it and try and say that this is a very coercive tax.
Haseeb is so right. These kind of unnecessary controversies are creating bad optics for the goods and services tax. It is alienating the consumer, who's a key stakeholder in the GST rollout. Worse, it is strengthening the hands of a section of politicians who are desperate to walk back India's marquee tax reform. And as the former Revenue Secretary Sanjay Malhotra and the new Governor of the Reserve Bank of India pointed out last month, these kind of needless tax iterations to maximize tax revenues is killing India's growth story. To cut a long story short, it is time to roll out GST 2.0. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNews Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.